And David Barsamian has joined me in the Daybreak studio. How are you, sir?
Well, thanks for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be in Calgary at CBC.
Why does the work continue for you?
Because it's interesting, because it fills a need, particularly in the United States where there is such a corporate domination of the media, and to provide news, information, and perspectives that are not getting on those official channels, let's say, is for me very satisfying, and there's a growing audience.
Before we get into the reason that you've come to Alberta, I want to get your take on what's happening with you folks on the other side of that border. It seems as though the Republican primary process, and even before that, the debate process that was going on, certainly hasn't identified a clear winner out of the candidates, and it may have even been a bit of a liability. What's been your take on the Republican Party and what's happening to it?
Well, the state of politics in the country is in acute distress, and I think what you see with the Republican Party is just a manifestation of that. Issues are not discussed, where the focus is on personality and so-called hot-button value topics like gay marriage. It's sad to see the political system literally disintegrating in front of one's eyes. At least that's my take on it. It's vacuous in its extreme.
If you want to put Mitt Romney, I guess, as the de facto front runner in all of this, the criticisms about him are very superficial. No one's sort of taking him on for any policies that he's espousing. It's all about he's robotic, he is fake, his wife drives 2 Cadillacs, and
well, that's been a trend in U.S. politics, not just with Mitt Romney, but for many, many decades when there are debates, when there are State of the Union addresses, that is when the president talks to the Congress and through the Congress, the country. Often the commentary that follows is more like a theater review than actually substantive in terms of issues. So we hear about the president looked very confident, or opposite, he seemed tentative. His body language was not very forthcoming. You're getting these kind of theater reviews. It just strikes me as preposterous. Issues then become obfuscated. What are the policies? What will their impact be on the American people and, because of the U.S. role in the world, on the rest of the world?
How Obama came to power, obviously was on this wave of change and there was this great hope for the nation, but it seems to have not materialized because, like every other president, he's had problems to deal with and his own skill level.
Well, you have to remember where the U.S. was in 2008 after arguably 8 years of one of the worst presidencies in the history of the United States. The Bush administration had generated a tremendous amount of animosity. And here you had this young, relatively unknown state senator and then U.S. senator from the state of Illinois, who one of his singular attributes was that he could speak English in complete sentences. So after 8 years of this fumbling Bush discourse, I think people were just ready for a change and willing to believe the slogans of the Obama campaign. Yes, we can. Change you can believe in. But it ignored the structural problems that are inherent in the U.S. political system. The role of money, the role of corporations. These are very deep-rooted parts of the edifice of the U.S. political system. And even someone who professed the willingness to change and to challenge Washington and to do things differently found very quickly that he could not, because of these built-in constraints and restraints of the structures. It's led to extreme disappointment among many of the young people that drove his campaign, that knocked on the doors, that sent those emails, that made those phone calls, that volunteered in huge numbers to get Obama elected in 2008. I think those people have basically disappeared and have reappeared in the Occupy movement. People who are fed up with business as usual in the United States, the fact that corporations have rights that people do not have, that the state is more interested in protecting the banks and Wall Street firms rather than keeping people in their homes or giving them jobs. All of these things now are open and are being discussed, and I think that's very positive. Saying all that, Obama will be reelected because of the paucity and the incredible weakness of his opposition.
There has been so much discussion around what Iran is doing or not doing with its uranium program. What's the likelihood that an Obama campaign can diffuse some of that rhetoric coming out of the Middle East?
Well, Obama has a Middle East policy that is inherently contradictory. On one hand, it supports the so-called Arab Spring, the revolts that have toppled some of the civilian dictators and military dictators. Notice not a single monarchy has fallen, and still the linchpin of U.S. and the focus of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia, which almost by definition is one of the most retrograde, misogynistic, homophobic, feudalistic regimes on the face of the earth. And then, of course, Israel is a major focus of U.S. policymakers in Washington. So here the U.S. is trying to promote democracy with a very checkered history of supporting some of the most retrograde regimes. And so oil remains the focus of attention, and that is what's driving U.S. foreign policy concerns. Now, will there be a war with Iran? The rhetoric is very, very high right now, bellicose, very belligerent. Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. As a member of that treaty, it has a right to develop uranium for peaceful purposes.
What kind of a factor do you think news out of North Korea is this week? The fact that they are scaling back their own nuclear program and not doing military testing and so forth as a way to reach out to the West for economic aid that they need?
I mean, I think that's a very positive development, and I think it's only been made possible because of the death of the previous ruler, a new generation taking over and realizing that North Korea and its population have been so incredibly isolated and also eviscerated and impoverished by state policy which has foreground military development over all other kinds of development. And so this is a good sign for sure.
How much of what Iran is about, though, is about waiting them out? You have a regime that has already seen some uprising in recent years, certainly during the Obama years.
It's hard to say because the history of sanctions actually has the opposite effect. It makes people more dependent on the regime. If there are food shortages in Iran, if there are shortages of basic goods, so it's not clear that there is going to be an upheaval. Again, all societies are complex. I was there a couple of years ago. I wrote a book about this called Targeting Iran. You have this very powerful sectarian movement in the country, the mullahs, the ayatollahs, but there's also a civil society as well, and a president that is not terribly popular with the average Iranian in the street, but Iranians are a very proud nation. They're an ancient They are very aware of their history and civilization, and they don't like to be slighted. They don't want to be insulted, and they see one set of rules for Israel, let's say, and another set of rules for Iran, and they don't like it. And they would like to be, I think, treated with dignity and respect.
Well, it was fascinating just the other night at the Oscars when Iran won Best Foreign Film. It was a fascinating speech by the producer that won it, and
yes,
definitely
Oscar Farhadi.
A message of peace, certainly.
Yes, and also to remind people that Iran is not some new kid on the block. We've been here a long time, very much like China. We're talking about some of the oldest civilizations on Earth.
I want to take this back to the discussion that you came to Alberta to give, and that's around language and politics. You call it Orwell's World and Ours.
Well, when Orwell wrote 1984 in 1948, he just inverted the year there, he predicted a kind of totalitarian future in which language played a very particular and urgent role in terms of controlling discourse and in terms of controlling the population. So everything became inverted. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And we see, even in the U.S. today, particularly in the corporate control media, how language is used to demonize. I mean, we were just talking about Iran. It is inevitably described as a sponsor of state terrorism, always in pejorative terms. There's never anything positive to say about Iran, whereas U.S. intentions are always altruistic, always benign, always wanting to help the underdog, always wanting to liberate women in Afghanistan or in Iran or in Iraq or some other country. And I think Orwell had an acute grasp of that. Having worked in the BBC, incidentally, for many years, he saw how propaganda worked at the BBC, how news was controlled, how it was edited, how it was presented, always favorable to the UK and its allies, and always in detriment to designated enemies. So I think we can learn a lot from Orwell. His essay, Politics in the English Language, is I think, the classic work on how euphemisms are used, how the passive voice is used. For example, you had Condoleezza Rice at the height of the Iraq War, arguably one of the greatest catastrophes in modern times, saying mistakes were made. Never giving agency. Who made those mistakes? Was it Bush? Was it Rice? Was it Dick Cheney? Was it Colin Powell? Who is responsible? No, mistakes were made. So the use of the passive voice, Orwell described very accurately, is a way to deflect the naming of names and clarity. It is the enemy of clarity.
Orwell inverted 48 to get 84. How do we flip it again? What would 2048, the novel, be?
2048 would be an Occupy novel. It would be a liberated media where words would make sense rather than be loaded dice constructed by Madison Avenue advertising wizards who are simply intent on either selling products or selling candidates to win elections. By the way, in 2008, Madison Avenue gave the Obama campaign its award of the year for advertising brilliance. Quite an achievement.
David Barsamian, a pleasure to meet you. We've spoken before, but a pleasure to actually have you in studio, and all the best with your work.
Thanks, Russell.